we're going to go over your options for Journal 1. So you'll find Journal 1 under the modules. You'll scroll down to Module 1, and there's the Journal 1 entry. You'll also find some tips and tricks that I provided for you to help coach you through the process in case even after going through this video with you, you still have questions or aren't sure how to start. You can always use this document to help you along. Okay. Once you've clicked on Journal 1, you'll see that here are the instructions, and then here's how you submit. Right. So let's go over the instructions first. So first, a journal is 300 words, maybe a little bit more than that. Okay, so it's a short essay, about a page, maybe a page and a half. It is an essay, but it is not a research assignment, right? So, and it's meant to be very reflective. Each of my classes, I use a different kind of graphic organizer to help outline the contents, not just for journals, but really for any of our content in our course. And so in modern culture, so Hume 201, I use a modified Venn diagram. You'll find that graphic organizer in the module overview document, also in the pre-module, and I'll be going over it with you in this micro lecture. All right, so to create a journal entry, the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna pre-write. So you're gonna choose artworks and artifacts. You're gonna probably need multiple ones, especially for my 201 class. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna look at these artworks or artifacts and try to help understand the module thesis and theme. All right, so you wanna make sure you pick these from the module, from the textbook, or from the multimedia resources. And like I said, these artworks and artifacts should explain the thesis or the argument of the module. Once you've done that, you're going to complete all the sections of the graphic organizer to outline your thoughts. And then you're going to use that graphic organizer to create a paragraph form essay, okay? So you're going to transfer that information to paragraph form, and you're going to be focusing on three major parts. First one are the connections. The second is the commentary, and the third is the conclusion. So these are the three major ideas that you need to address. The first one is connections, are your relationships and links between ideas. So you're gonna look at these artifacts and see how do they fit into the context of the module, of the textbook, and of the course theme. Then you're gonna make some commentaries. These are your opinions and your explanations. Now, these are your reactions. It's your reflection to the works and to the ideas. And then last, you're going to make your conclusions. So these are decisions reached by reasoning. The difference between an uninformed opinion and an informed opinion is the difference between your feelings and intuitions versus a conclusion, right? So a conclusion is an opinion based on evidence, on logic, on rationality. An uninformed opinion is just kind of a feeling you might have about the world, but with no basis behind it. Then lastly, you're going to rewrite. You're going to read your journal out loud. You're going to edit for grammar and punctuation, look for clarity, and double check that you've covered the material in a real meaningful way. You're also going to include an image, at least one image for every artwork or artifact you talk about. If you don't include the images, you do lose substantial points in your journal, so make sure you're doing that. And make sure you're embedding and not attaching. Lastly, you want to make sure you also include citations to any outside sources. The idea here is that if you paraphrase or summarize from even your textbook, you need to cite that. Now, if you don't use any outside sources, that's fine. You don't necessarily need to. And in that case, you wouldn't need to cite. But anything that isn't your own ideas or thoughts could get flagged by the plagiarize checker, and you want to make sure that you have cited that. All right, so that is how you find the journal and where the journal is at. So now I have prepared for you a sample of what you can do for your first journal. Our first journal here, I'm going to do a brief walkthrough of some of the ideas and the methods of accomplishing. All right, so we're in Module 1, and in Module 1, we're looking at the pre-modern worldview. So to understand that, we're going to use this Venn diagram. All right, so this Venn diagram is a modified Venn. So if you've ever used one before, they're usually used for comparing and contrasting. So you put all the similarities here in the center, and you put the differences on the sides. And we're going to use it the same way, except we're going to add one more component to it, And that's we're going to be looking at two pieces here on the left and how they lead to the right. So although they're different, they will lead into this other side, okay? So we're looking at three major parts of the artworks and artifacts. So when you analyze the artworks and artifacts, these are the three things you're looking at: context, subtext, and text. Now, Fierro does a really great job of explaining this in the text, so feel free to look through sections. But basically, she argues, and this is part of the humanities, that we can read any form of expression. So that could be visual art, performing art, literary art. We can read it just like you read any kind of text, and that forms the expression. So if I wanted to read text, that's very easy, right? Like I read like written form, I look at the words, those words, the sentences, the paragraphs create meaning for me. Well, I can use the same part of my brain and the same part of my neurological processes to analyze things like a painting or a sculpture or a photograph or a musical composition or a theatrical performance. I can analyze it and read it in the same way. When I look at a painting, I'm not reading letters and words. What I'm reading is colors and composition and symbols that are used, which give me deeper meaning. So that's how we read text. And for our purposes in the humanities, the visual arts and the performing arts are text, just like the literary arts, right? So visual arts, painting, sculpture, architecture, the performing arts, music and theater and film, they can all be read just like poetry and narrative and story. What we're looking for when we're reading these things is context and subtext, right? So text is always in the background of the environment. That environment is philosophical, it's cultural, it's historical, right? Things aren't made in a bubble. So instead, we look at how does history, how did the culture of the day, how did the society of the era, how did those things influence the art being created? And we also look for the subtext. The subtext is the meaning that's underneath the blatant words being used, right? So if I was to read something and just look at the words themselves, I'll get some understanding of it. But I want to go to another level of the subtlety and the things that are implied to get to a whole level of meaning that we might not see on the surface. That's your subtext. And that's meaning through inference and interpretation. Inference is drawing conclusions of something based on the evidence at hand. Interpretations are inferences from particular points of view. So you can take an inference from the perspective of the audience or the viewer. You can also take an inference from the perspective of the artist. So we look at text, we look at text meaning for subtext and context. So our course, we're trying to understand how the modern period became the modern period, right? How did we go in this phenomenal 20th century world? We started that in the 1900s, riding horses, and ending it flying to the moon and creating the internet, right? Like, how did we go from rather simple lifestyles that have been going on for thousands and thousands of years to completely revolutionizing the way that the world works in the 20th century? Well, it didn't happen overnight, and it's framed in the 18th and 19th centuries, right? The 20th century is a direct byproduct out of those previous eras. So we start this class by looking at the pre-modern era, and specifically the philosophies of theism and deism. Then once we get through that, in the next module, we'll be looking at the modern era and see how the early 20th century came to be. And we'll wrap the course up by looking at the postmodern era and seeing how the end of the 20th century came to be. So by interpreting pre-modern philosophies, modern philosophies, and postmodern philosophies, we understand how modifying traditional beliefs created modern ideas and the ways of living. Or in other words, the intersection of philosophy and art tell us how we got to who we are today. All right, so we're going to start in the earliest part of the Enlightenment period. The Enlightenment period leads directly into the 20th century. Okay? And that Enlightenment period begins with great philosophical thinkers. Look at people like Rousseau and John Locke and Hobbes, but it also has people like John Milton who was a poet and a writer, okay, an author. And Milton's most famous for his work, Paradise Lost, an epic poem that spans hundreds and hundreds of pages, which explains the fall of mankind. So it's a biblical poem, and it's a retelling of the war in heaven and how Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Milton wanted to write this poem in the same kinds of traditions as other sagas, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, or Beowulf. Right? And so he even invokes those kinds of writings. He's trying to create this very Christian narrative. In it, he creates a figure and really a main character, and that is Lucifer. I almost called him a protagonist, and that's because Lucifer features highly as a big major character arc, the story arcs about the story. He is still the villain, so he's not really the protagonist. Right? He is still the villain, and he's still antagonistic. The difficulty of Paradise Lost, though, is that we end up empathizing with Lucifer because Lucifer is one of the most human characters out of the whole saga. Milton has an incredible task and he's trying to write this epic, but he's trying to write from God's perspective as well. And one of his biggest problems is God as a character is very difficult to write because God is omnipotent and all-knowing. And often when you read Paradise Lost, God seems very aloof and almost cold. And that's because John Milton himself is only a mortal being. He can't write as God. So he has to kind of fill in those gaps, and he leaves God kind of aloof. Because of that, as the reader, we tend to not sympathize with God. We tend to sympathize more often with Lucifer. Now, Lucifer is still a bad guy, and Milton is not a Satan worshiper. So please don't make that mistake to think that he is somehow celebrating Satan. Satan still falls. Satan still lives in hell, the greatest punishment in the universe. But there are a couple of twists in the story, and this leads us to some of the ideas that are come up later in this little micro lecture about theism's shift to deism. And one of those biggest twists is that the way Milton writes Lucifer is Lucifer seems very much like the character Prometheus out of Greek mythology. So if you're unfamiliar with the story of Prometheus, Prometheus was a Greek god who pitied humankind. Humankind was savage. They were just, kind of living like all the wild animals of the world. And there was a divine rule, specifically by Zeus, that said the gods could not teach mortal human beings the ways of the gods. Well, Prometheus pitied them, and he actually brings fire to humankind. Now, fire is symbolic, but it's also real, right? So fire allows humankind to do all kinds of things like progress, cook their meat, create weaponry and tools, and move into a higher level of being. But it also represents knowledge. Fire casts light in the darkness, right? And one of the most precarious times for human beings to be alive is at nighttime without protection. So what Prometheus is doing here is he's doing two things. He's allowing humankind to move into a higher level of being, but he's also giving them the symbol of knowledge. For doing this, he is punished. Zeus confines him to a mountainside, and an eagle comes and eats Prometheus's liver every night. And then that liver regrows in the morning, and the whole thing repeats. And this is the torture that Prometheus is given for showing humankind the way. Lucifer falls in a very similar way in Milton's poem. Now, Lucifer is angry with God for creating mortal beings, specifically celebrating Adam and Eve as being better. Lucifer says, he's a perfect angel, and he literally is one of the best worshipers, the most highly prized of the angels by God. But when Adam and Eve are created, jealousy kind of takes hold of Lucifer. And that's one of the reasons Lucifer falls. He rebels against God out of that jealousy. And what does Lucifer do then? He goes down to the Garden of Eden, and he tries to entice Adam and Eve to do the same thing, to reject God's rule and reject authority, and eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Hence, that knowledge being another connection between Prometheus and Lucifer. And Lucifer also being kind of this champion of fighting against tradition and fighting against just blind faith and authority, that God, this kind of aloof character in the poem, who doesn't seem to have a real connection with his creation. So these are actually not just parts of Milton's writing, but they're also parts of Milton's questioning. Milton was questioning the dogma and the doctrines of the church of his day. Now, he's a devout Christian, but he's also got a lot of questions and issues with the way Christianity is carried out. So one of the things that Milton is kind of showing is that there are issues with theism. All right, so what is theism? Let's define that. Theism is the belief in a personal God, a perfect, omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing being, a supreme entity who meddles in the affairs and is involved with mortal beings, right? A personal God, a God that lives and works and communicates with his creation. That's theism. And to this day, theism is the most prominent version of religion. The three major monotheistic religions are theistic, right? So we've got Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. All three of those monotheistic religions believe in a personal God that you can pray to and who will involve himself in the affairs of humankind. Many of the polytheistic and pantheistic religions out of the East also have personal and involved gods. So, for instance, in Hinduism and Jainism and Sikhism, these all believe that God is still involved in our lives. And even teachings like the Buddhists often have the gods active in daily life. So theism is by far the most prominent and popular version of religion. And Milton was a theist, but he was also starting to question some blind faith and the church. And this is the path towards deism. And Lucifer kind of embodies that. Again, Milton is not a Satan worshiper, so please don't make that mistake. He is simply using Lucifer as a way to question some of these ideas. And he's doing so by borrowing from the great epics and myths of history. Another theist who leans toward deism is Isaac Newton. So in this Enlightenment period, the philosophy kind of dominates the way people are starting to think about the world and how they see the world. And Isaac Newton takes it to the next level. So Newton not only works in logic, but he starts to work and develop a system of calculus. And the idea behind calculus is a way to measure motion. Newton's preoccupied with trying to understand how the heavens work. How do the planets go around the sun? How do the moons travel around their planets? How do the stars move across the sky? What are the rules and systems that are in place that God created in order to make this work? Like Milton, Newton is a devout Christian, and he actually spent a lot of his time also studying the Bible. But when he develops his theories of gravity, he starts to recognize that the cosmos, the celestial heavens, operate the same way that terrestrial Earth does. In other words, the rules that make the planets go around the sun are the same rules that make apples fall from trees. What are those rules? They're the rules of gravity. He writes this in the Principia Mathematica. He writes this over and over again, and he presents these ideas all throughout Europe. And what he's looking at is he's showing he can predict where the planets will be with incredible accuracy using mathematics. What he's saying, though, is that he has decoded the secret messages of creation. He knows the language of God. He knows how God created the universe. God created the universe using mathematics. God's mind is mathematics. And for Newton, that means he understands a perfect cosmos using gravity and calculus. There's a problem, though. And that problem is miracles. If you're going to have a perfect system that works in perfect harmony, you can't have supernatural things. You can't have miracles because that changes the rules and it has long-term effects. An analogy is often derived is the watch and the watchmaker. So if you look at a watch and you take it apart, you notice that all the gears and gizmos are wound in perfect harmony to make the watch work. If you change one of those gears or if one of those things are timed incorrectly, the watch won't work anymore, right? So if the cosmos is a massive watch and everything is moving in these kind of like patterned ways and these orbits around everything, it has to be perfectly timed. You can't allow for things to get kind of shifted left or right because it would have massive effects, right? If Jupiter fell off of its kind of course and slammed into Mars, then Mars is going to spin out of control. Everything has to be working in harmony. And Newton said, well, if the cosmos works in harmony, Earth also has to work in harmony because they are operating under the same rules. And that's why the miracles can't happen, because if you have a miracle, then the watch wouldn't work anymore. If you have these gears perfectly timed and once in a while you just do anything you want willy-nilly, you'd throw the whole thing out of whack. So that leads people like Newton to start thinking of God as more of a watchmaker as opposed to a personal God. What that means is God wound up the universe and created everything using the rules of mathematics, of calculus, of gravity. He made everything orbit. He timed everything perfectly. He created a perfect universe, but he steps back because if he were to interfere, he would not make the universe wouldn't be able to work anymore. It would fall apart. So we have this idea of what's known as a watchmaker God, and this is the birth of deism. Deism is the opposite of theism in that deists do not believe that there is a personal God. They believe that there is a God, a supreme being of incredible intelligence beyond anything any mortal could fathom, and he uses that intelligence to create the universe, but he does not monkey with it once it's created. He winds up the gears and he steps back. He does not use miracles or the supernatural. So this leads us to some of the greatest experiments ever created from a deistic perspective. It leads us to Thomas Jefferson, who is one of the culminating figures of the Enlightenment period. Now remember, the Enlightenment period is this time which celebrates intellect, reason, and rationality. And it says things like miracles can't happen because we cannot prove them using experimentation, premise, logic, and reason. So although there's a lot of controversy about this, Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He began his life as a theist, and he struggled with religion throughout his life, but he did end his days as a deist, and we know this from a handful of things. He kept pretty copious writings of his personal ideas. He wrote letters to John Adams, who was a rival and eventually a friend. But most importantly, he wrote the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth, often known as the Jefferson Bible. This Bible removes the miracle. If God is the watchmaker God, if God created a perfect, harmonious universe, the miracles change that. And so therefore the miracles can't be there. So what Jefferson did is he took a knife and he started cutting out all the sections out of the Bible that had miracles. So virgin birth, turning wine from water into wine, walking on water, raising the dead, miraculously healing the sick. He removed all these things. The entire Old Testament really didn't work for him because it's just full of supernatural, of monsters, and giants, and angels, and demons, all these kinds of magic that he just said we couldn't prove with reason and rationality. So the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth is this very tiny book composed of the four Gospels, so Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. But it has no miracles in it. It's just the story and biography of Jesus a teacher who shows people the righteous way to live through a moral life. Now, this thinking that Jefferson has great implications in the world around him, because if he's questioning God's motives on earth or God's involvement on earth, then one of the best places to see that being played out is rule. Who rules the world at his time? Monarchs. And who are these monarchs? Kings and queens who have been chosen by God to rule. They have divine right. If you look at the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, right, all the way throughout history, kings and queens are literally adorned. They're given a crown by people like the Pope and religious leaders, right? Spokesmen for God. God is choosing who should rule the world. Well, Jefferson's questioned this because Jefferson doesn't believe that God is meddling in these affairs. He's a deist. He believes that God is a watchmaker. So then what gives the king the right to rule? What gives a queen the right to take over? What gives them the right to conquer lands? Gives them the right to tell other people how to live? And he reasons it's their own minds. It's not somehow a divinely inspired way. And because of that, he reasons that's wrong. That is not a righteous path. Those people stole that power. They're not entitled to it. They're lying about how they got it. They're lying about how they use it. And they're unjust. They're just as flawed and just full of sin, just like any other mortal. Now, Jefferson was a devout Christian. He just believed in this deistic version of it. He believed in Jesus' teachings. He just had a problem with this idea that kings and queens would derive their power from a divine right. So, in the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that Jefferson co-authored, along with a lot of other founding fathers who were also deists, like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, they start to question this idea and they say, no more. There is no divine right. We will have a country that rules through logic and reason. We will look at the great thinkers of ancient Greece and Rome. We'll look at things like the deistic teachings of the philosophers of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Rousseau and these major philosophical thinkers. And we will govern our nation through philosophy. Because what is the United States of America? It's a code of ethics. It's a code of rules. It's reason. It's rationality. It's law. The government of the United States is created by law, and law is derived from logic. That was the argument. The argument was that we can do a better job creating a government and a country and a nation than just allowing nature to take its course, allowing certain kings to rise to power and say that the reason they have that power is because God chose them. This is the great American experiment. It's a premise backed up by testing and evidence, which leads to a conclusion. Now, there was another figure in history, another deist, who really celebrated what Jefferson was trying to do. And that is William Blake. And this kind of ends the Enlightenment period. So we start with John Milton at the beginning of the Enlightenment. We go all the way through the end towards William Blake, who was actually a romantic as well. So the romantics actually thought that you could use your emotion and things like love and nature and beauty to understand the universe. Blake was kind of a blend of the two. He also believed in the intellect and the power of the mind. Now, Blake loved America. He thought America was a brilliant idea, but he also found America to be very tragic. He thought America fell short of its great purpose. Because see, Blake was incredibly forward-thinking for his time. This is a person who didn't believe in slavery, believed that all the races of the world were equal, believed that women were equal, and that the genders were equal, and that women were just as intellectual as men. And he thought America fell short because it did not fulfill those lives and those prophecies. Now, Blake is from England. He's a British person. And so when he looks at what America is doing, he says, you know, this is amazing. They're overthrowing this king that is, you know, taking advantage of rules that aren't necessarily true, that aren't reasonable, that are miraculous. And you'll look at Blake's work, and Blake is highly influenced by a lot of the thinkers we just talked about. So over here on the right, this painting is known as the Ancient of Days. And this is a picture of God creating the universe using a compass. He's inscribing the circles of the planets using the tool of a mathematician. The days of creation aren't being created by miracles, they're created by mathematics. The bottom down here, this is actually a picture of Isaac Newton doing the same thing, but look at how Newton looks. He's not the normal picture that we see of him. He looks like Apollo, the Greek god, right? He's incredibly physically fit and he's luminous, he's lit up by light, and he too is inscribing and measuring the universe, right? Now, it's not, Blake didn't think that Newton was somehow this larger than life figure physically, but he did so in the terms of ideas and the ideas of philosophy. And then we've got this top picture here, which is very controversial because it's actually a picture of Lucifer. See, Blake did a series of paintings and engravings for Paradise Lost. And he depicts Lucifer not as a bat-winged devil or some kind of evil figure, but Blake depicts Lucifer as a hero. He too is not a Satan worshiper, so we have to be very careful with this. He does not believe in evil. What he believes is that mankind should revolt and rebel against tradition and authority. It's our duty to use our minds for righteous purposes, to live a moral life, to be a good person, but to do so in contrast to things like organized religion, which he had issues with. See, so he celebrates Lucifer in the sense that Lucifer challenges authority and embraces knowledge. He embraces this Lucifer figure that's like Prometheus, who's being punished because he didn't follow the rules. And for Blake, not following the rules is actually the best use of our creativity and our passion and our love. Okay, so we've got these four figures, and we're charting the progress from theism to deism throughout the Enlightenment period, but also the early birth of what's going to become the 20th century ideals. We're shifting from that idea of a very personal God to a watchmaker God, and then to the idea that you don't use spirituality to understand the universe, you use reason and logic. You don't use, the ancient texts to understand the world. You use science and the experimentation and the principles of the Enlightenment. So if you're going to put all of this information into our Venn diagram, what we're comparing and contrasting here is theism to deism, right? We're seeing the similarities and differences between these two philosophies and how they play out in the arts. So our context here is theism, right? We would never have deism without it. Deism is a rejection of theism. And Milton and Newton, these are theistic people, right? They are questioning some of these theistic principles and they are challenging them, but they are theists themselves, right? So Milton and Newton are both devout Christians. They believe in salvation through Jesus Christ. They believe in God, but they start to question the principles of theism, of this omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing being. Specifically for Newton, it becomes a question of miracles. Specifically for Milton, it becomes a question of knowledge and morality, right? Newton is wondering, how can miracles exist? Because it would destroy his mathematical perfection. Milton's wondering, the church carries out terrible, terrible things in the name of God. How can that be true? He also questions things like the problems of evil. Like, why is there evil in the world? Why do children suffer? Why are there natural disasters? Why does God allow these things to happen if he's interfering with every day? These challenging questions lead Newton to even embrace a deeper set of questions where he starts to reject a personal God. And then people like Thomas Jefferson, who eventually do reject that and embrace deism. So that subtext is the challenge of authority, that challenge of tradition, that those two things aren't true. Interestingly enough, appeals to tradition and appeals to authority are logical fallacies. Those are not logical reasons, right? They're not good for argumentation. Things that have been done always shouldn't just be done for that reason, or because someone tells you to do so isn't the right reason to do so. All of this then culminates in the text that we looked at, which are those paintings from William Blake, right? And those William Blake works are set in this context of theism and the rejection of it and the embracing of deism. You could also make the argument that Thomas Jefferson's writings, especially his the Jeffersonian Bible, is a text of deism. And certainly the Declaration of Independence is a text of deism. And the Great Experiment, the Democratic Republic, is a version of that. So to write up this, you could take something like the works of Blake, the works of Jefferson, put them in the context of Milton and Isaac Newton, and see how this all plays out of looking at theism and deism. Now, if you don't like my artifacts that I've chosen, certainly you can go through the text and the multimedia resources and find other examples of theism and deism and show the comparison and contrast and the subtext, context, and text of theism and deism in those works. I look forward to seeing your writings. Good luck, and as always, if you've got questions, please reach out.